Hi everybody, and welcome to Lesson 5.1, Ecosystems and Energy Flow. The content in this video is aligned to the third edition of Environmental Science for AP and is aligned to CED Units 1.2, 1.3, 1.8 through 1.11. Here are our content objectives for this lesson. Ecosystems are the result of biotic and abiotic interactions, and energy can be converted from one form to another. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of terrestrial biomes, describe the global distribution and principal economic aspects of aquatic biomes, explain how solar energy is acquired and transferred by living organisms, explain how energy flows and matter cycles through trophic levels, and describe food chains and food webs and their consistent members by trophic level. This leads us to answer our guiding question. How do ecosystems generate and use energy? Before we dive too deep, it's important that we clearly separate the idea of a biome and an ecosystem. When we talk about biomes, we are talking about large geographic areas that share common characteristics, like climate and flora or fauna. Biomes can spread over very large areas and can be found on different continents, as long as the general characteristics are met. Ecosystems exist within biomes and are made up of the interconnected biotic and abiotic factors in a smaller geographic area. Multiple ecosystems can be found in a single biome. It is important to keep these ideas separated as we continue in our discussion. Biomes are defined by two major characteristics, climate and flora and fauna. Climate, as we know, is the average temperature and precipitation patterns of an area over an approximate 30-year span of time. When we discuss biomes, there are three factors that contribute to climate that we need to be familiar with: precipitation, temperature, and latitude. We know that precipitation and temperature are often correlated with each other. Warmer areas are more likely to have higher precipitation than colder areas in general. However, this is not a 100% connection. Latitude, or distance north or south from the equator, plays a role as well. Areas near the equator often have more precipitation than those that are far away from the equator. Distance from large bodies of water also plays a role, as those areas that are closer to large bodies of water tend to have more precipitation than those that are further away. Additionally, biomes are defined by the flora and fauna, the plants and animals that live in the area. These organisms are often particularly adapted to the conditions that define the biome, making it easier for them to exist across continents. Let's take a moment to identify the major terrestrial biomes that you see here. We will work from the poles toward the equator. The poles are made up of tundra, also known as a cold desert. A key characteristic of tundra is permafrost, or a layer of permanently frozen ice beneath which small, hardy grasses can grow. Next comes the boreal forest, also known as the taiga, which is made up of coniferous trees. Note that this biome can also be found at high altitudes, or vertical distance from sea level. The next biome depends on many different conditions, such as the distance from large bodies of water or soil composition, so there are a few different options. You could come in contact with a temperate forest, or a forest with distinct seasons that is made up of either coniferous or deciduous trees, or a mixture of both. Or you could experience a grassland. It is important to note that a grassland is unable to support trees due to the condition of its soil. Be careful that you don't confuse a grassland with a savanna, which is more tropical and is able to support small stands of trees. You could also meet what is known as a chaparral, or Mediterranean scrub forest. These areas have short shrubs and very particular organisms. They are often transitional biomes between grasslands or forests and deserts. Deserts, also known as hot deserts, are areas found at approximately 30 degrees latitude north and south. Savannas may appear next in transition into tropical forests, which are often high in precipitation, leading to them being called tropical rainforests. By now, we've traveled from the poles across various latitudes to the equator. Another way of understanding terrestrial biomes is by looking at what are called climatograms. These graphs are used to visualize the relationship between precipitation and temperature across a year's time in a particular biome. Here you see three graphs that compare three types of forest: tropical rainforest, temperate deciduous forest, and a boreal forest. Note that these are biaxial graphs, meaning it is two independent y-axes with a shared x-axis. The left y-axis measures mean temperature in degrees, while the right measures precipitation in millimeters. The x-axis shows the month of the year. The red line is associated with the temperature, while the blue shaded area is associated with precipitation. Let's look at these. As you can see, across the types of forest, precipitation decreases with an increase in latitude. This is relatively consistent. Temperature, however, fluctuates with greater variation as we move toward the poles. Tropical forests are characterized by consistent high temperatures in seasons of heavy rain. Boreal forests, on the other hand, have greater temperature fluctuations, but the precipitation seems to follow the same pattern as the temperature changes over the year. Aquatic biomes are identified almost exclusively by their salt content. It's important to remember that even fresh water contains salt. The difference is the proportion or concentration. Fresh water is by definition significantly less salty than the ocean. And there are three major categories of aquatic biomes: freshwater, marine, and brackish. Freshwater biomes include lakes, streams, and some wetlands. Marine biomes include the open ocean, coral reefs, and intertidal zones. These areas have relatively high concentrations of salt. Brackish biomes are those that have a salt concentration somewhere between fresh and salt water. They are often places where these two biomes overlap, creating an area known as an ecotone. Brackish biomes include estuaries, mangrove forests, and swamps. Let's take a moment to look a little more closely at two different aquatic biomes: the ocean and a lake. We'll begin with the ocean. There are 6 major pieces of the ocean that are important for you to know. The two largest divisions are the oceanic or pelagic zone and the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone, as its name suggests, is the area between high tide and low tide, and is often a very diverse ecosystem. The pelagic zone is simply the open ocean. This section is further divided vertically into the photic and aphotic zones. The photic zone is the very thin surface section where sunlight is able to penetrate into the water. This is where photosynthesis takes place. The aphotic zone includes all of those places where sunlight cannot reach. Lastly, there are 2 divisions determined by the distance from the surface. The benthic zone is the largest area of the ocean floor beneath the surface. The abyssal zone includes the deepest parts of the ocean. As for lakes, the divisions are much more simple. The width of the lake is divided into 2 areas: the littoral zone along the banks where submerged plants exist, and the limnetic zone, that is the open lake. A lake has a euphotic zone where sunlight reaches, and an aphotic zone, sometimes referred to as the profundal zone. The very bottom is the benthic zone. Lakes are also identified by their productivity: oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic. Note that highly productive lakes are known as eutrophic lakes, and this can be a good thing. Make sure that you keep this positive process separated from the negative process of eutrophication. Now that we have identified the major biomes of the world, it's important for us to discuss the ways in which ecosystems gather, use, and transmit energy. This entire process is related to what is known as gross primary productivity. Photosynthetic organisms, such as trees, grass, shrubs, phytoplankton, and cyanobacteria, use various wavelengths of sunlight to produce glucose. It is important to note here that some organisms deep in the benthic areas of the ocean use chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis to reach the same ends. Net primary productivity is the balance of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. It relates to the amount of glucose energy that is used to produce biomass. It is this energy that is transferred up the food chain. As you can see in the formula, net primary productivity is equal to the gross primary productivity, or total photosynthesis, minus cellular respiration. We already know that some biomes and areas of the world are more productive than others. The graph on the right shows that estuaries, swamps, and marshes are the largest producers in the world. This shouldn't be surprising, as aquatic biomes make up the majority of the Earth's surface. Let's stop and take a moment to discuss the connection between energy generation and biomass. In terrestrial ecosystems, there is a directly proportional relationship between the two. The majority of the biomass is made up of organisms that are photosynthetic. This means that plants make up the largest percentage of the mass of the ecosystem. Conversely, there is an inversely proportional relationship between energy and biomass in the aquatic ecosystem. This means that while producers make up the majority of energy producers, they are the smallest overall in terms of mass. This makes sense, as there is a very small photic zone in the open ocean, but there are vastly large organisms that live deeper in the waters that, collectively, make up much more mass than phytoplankton. Now that we have discussed how energy is generated in an ecosystem, let's discuss how it gets moved throughout. First, let's define some terms. A producer is any photosynthetic or chemosynthetic organism that produces glucose for energy. A consumer is anything that eats another organism, and they are defined in two ways: what they eat and how far removed they are from the producers. Herbivores eat only plants and are considered primary consumers. Omnivores can eat plants or animals and often make up secondary consumers. Carnivores eat only meat and make up tertiary or even quaternary consumers, both of which can also be identified as an apex predator. It's important to note that most ecosystems never go beyond a tertiary consumer, as the amount of energy transferred becomes far too small to support the large body of the predator. Detrivores and decomposers exist outside this pyramid because they take energy from all sources, though they still function on the diminishing returns of energy transfer. When we speak about diminishing returns of energy transfer, we are discussing the second law of thermodynamics in action. Remember that the second law states that no energy conversion is 100% efficient. Some of that energy will be lost due to heat during the transfer. We can use the 10% rule as a general tool to understand the movement of this energy. What we mean here is that for every step up the trophic pyramid, 90% of the energy is lost. This means that only 10% of the energy will transfer, and requires organisms higher on the pyramid to consume larger numbers of organisms to meet their energy needs. Now that we've discussed trophic pyramids, let's take a brief detour into food webs and food chains. First, let's make sure that we understand the notation of the arrow. The arrow points toward the consumer in the direction of energy flow. Simplistically, a food chain is a smaller component of a food web. It is a direct chain of consumption from producer up through a single organism to the final consumer. In isolation, food chains are easier to understand, but they are more likely to fall apart if a single component is removed. Food webs, on the other hand, are inherently more stable as there are more options of food for each layer of the ecosystem. However, it is possible for the removal of an organism from a complex food web to lead to what is known as a trophic cascade. This occurs when the removal of one organism is directly responsible for negative effects throughout the ecosystem. A classic example of this is the removal of the gray wolf from Yellowstone National Park. The wolf served as the apex predator in the food web, which served to make the effects even more extensive and apparent. Without the gray wolf, its prey populations exploded without check. Elk populations boomed, which led to overgrazing of land and destruction of trees, which reduced primary productivity and decimated the resources needed by organisms like beavers. Additionally, the lack of wolf kills made it difficult for scavenger organisms to meet their energy needs. However, after their reintroduction in 1995, the ecosystem recovered and returned to its pre-1920s health. This occurred because the gray wolf is what we know as a keystone species. These are organisms whose impact in the ecosystem is often disproportionate to its number. In other words, it is an exceptionally important organism that maintains the stability and health of an ecosystem. Some keystone species also serve as what we call an indicator species, or a measure of the health and stability of an ecosystem or environment. However, most indicator species are microinvertebrates and other small organisms. The following slide provides you with an opportunity to see how some of these ideas are connected together. Feel free to pause the video and explore the connections between these topics. Then, use the statements at the beginning to review.